Welcome to As I Live and Grieve, a podcast that tells the truth about how hard this is. We're glad you joined us today. We know how hard it is to lose someone you love and how well-intentioned friends and family try so hard to comfort us. We created this podcast to provide you with comfort, knowledge, and support. We are grief advocates, not professionals, not licensed therapists. We are you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back again to another episode of As I Live and Grieve. Oh, you've heard it every time. I know. I have a great guest. Well, I have a great guest again today. I have Rebecca Feinglos with me today. Rebecca, thanks for joining me.
Kathy, thank you so much. And I even just loved talking to you before recording turned on. I just know we absolutely are going to hit it off.
You know, isn't this just amazing how you can do something like a podcast? This for me is amazing. You can do a podcast and someone will connect with you somehow, whether you meet them or they reach out to you. And thank you, Tori, for reaching out. And then all of a sudden you become like, oh gosh, I think I've known you all my life. And just you're networked. And I have expanded my extended family exponentially since starting this podcast, which now is almost 4 years ago. Almost.
Oh gosh, congratulations. That's the beautiful thing about grief too. It is like this great connector. Maybe it's like the only beautiful thing about grief.
Well, I don't think it's the only beautiful thing, but I think another beautiful thing is just the people we become.
Yeah.
During and while we're grieving. So, but anyway, for today, time goes by so quickly. So Rebecca, would you help us by starting out and just telling our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Totally. Kathy, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited. I'm Rebecca Feinglos. I'm originally from Durham, North Carolina, but as we connected on, I have upstate New York roots.
There you go, see?
So my late father was from Syracuse, New York.
Just an hour down the road.
And I spent a lot of time as a kid going out there, visiting his parents. And then we were talking about this too, his best friend lived in Rochester. We called him Uncle Bill. So I have spent a lot of time in your neck of the woods. I love that. I think that most folks in their early 30s wouldn't immediately start a conversation and be like, hey, I'm Rebecca, and, I want to tell you about my parents, because most people my age, maybe their parents aren't such an integral part of their lives.
Right.
Both of my parents are deceased. And so when I tell my story, I kind of have to start with them. But in short, by the age of 31, both of my parents had died, and I was in the middle of a divorce that was a good choice, but a very difficult one.
Sure.
And I found myself really struggling and overwhelmed by the idea of grief and loss, which most 31-year-olds haven't experienced the death of two parents, right, and probably maybe they are starting to get divorced. It was first of my friends too. First of my friends to get married, Kathy, first of my friends to get divorced. I guess, the timeline, it makes sense. And I felt very overwhelmed. Yeah. I had a wonderful career that I'd built that was focused on government and policy and education. And my mom had died of brain cancer when I was a child. My dad died very suddenly on day one of COVID lockdown.
Oh, dear.
Yeah. And a year later, my marriage ended. And a year after that, I said, something has to change in my life. Yes. I'm overwhelmed by the idea of grief, and I don't have the vocabulary for it. Mm-hmm. I was in a position where I took a year off of work to explore this idea of grief and loss that I didn't have the words for, but I had a feeling was like that was the thing that was overwhelming me.
Right.
And it turned out as I took that year off, I wrote about my grief and loss on a blog called GrieveLeave.com. And I found that in exploring the idea of grief and loss, both death and non-death related grief, because there's grief that comes with the divorce too.
Yes.
For other kinds of losses.
Yes.
That it turned out that I actually wasn't alone. I wasn't the only person who knew that had these kinds of feelings. And that blog took off, and eventually I grew it to be a company that I now run called Grieve Leave.
Good.
And I support people all over the world, particularly young people who are grieving all kinds of losses. And it has been an incredible 180-degree pivot in my life over the past few years. And I'm so honored to be here with you talking about all things grief.
Oh, well, we could argue all day about who is more honored, but I'll win. But having said that, your company, Grieve Leave, you mentioned you support people who are grieving. How? How do you support them?
It's a really great question. And I think it stems from how unsupported I felt in my own grief at first. Mm-hmm. My mom died of glioblastoma, the deadliest form of brain cancer.
That is exactly what my husband had.
Stop. Oh, so you know.
Indeed. We have a parallel now.
You know.
Second parallel. I know.
Glioblastoma is devastating. I'd like tear up immediately. I'm so sorry that you can relate. It is devastating. My mom was diagnosed when I was 5. And as you know, Kathy, a glioblastoma is a death sentence.
It is.
Which is awful.
Yep.
My mom lived for 8 years with her.
That's amazing.
Disease.
That's amazing.
At the time of her death in 2002, she was the longest living person who had a glioblastoma. My late father was a physician at Duke University, and my mom ran the Duke Medical Center library. So they had her in many clinical trials.
Wow.
And she survived, but it was not a pretty picture. As you know, when someone is struggling with deterioration of the brain,
exactly,
it's not going to be a good home environment.
No, and it's very deceiving because many times it presents itself better than it really is.
It's like that physical person, too, is there, but they're not cognitively there.
Exactly.
As a kid, I didn't have the words grief and grieving, and grief support didn't really exist for me because I was the good kid. I was the kid that was doing well at school. I was the kid that had a lot of friends. And so I wasn't seeing a therapist. I wasn't getting any kind of grief support. And all things considered, I presented great. So cool. No grief support. Mm-hmm. Then when my dad died and I felt so overwhelmed, I threw myself first back into work, thinking that would support me. And then that doesn't work over time. When you are in the middle of a pandemic, your marriage is also falling apart and both of your parents are dead and you're leading all this work in state government at the time. It was too much. And when I took my year off on Grieve Leave, one of the first things that I wanted to figure out was what does grief support look like in a way that actually feels relevant to me as a 31-year-old?
Right.
I did not want to, though I went and tried, there were a few grief support groups in Durham, North Carolina, where I live, that were located in a church basement at 4:00 on a Tuesday. And I went twice. I was the youngest person by decades. Mm-hmm. And I'm Jewish. Being in a church space and being in that kind of a religious setting didn't resonate with me.
Right.
And so what I have found over the course of that year and since creating my company is that I wanted to build grief support that felt really relevant and that felt very community rooted and met people, millennials and Gen Z, but all people, wherever they are in their experience with grief. So Grieve Leave hosts online grief support groups on Zoom. We have hosted grief support events in bars, in exercise classes. They are about just bringing people together who are grieving, whether you are grieving the same kind of losses, like maybe deaths of a parent or deaths of a spouse, or you are grieving some kind of non-death related loss. We love bringing people together. That's a big way that we support grievers through Grieve Leave. I also do trainings for businesses on how to support employees who are grieving so they don't quit. And we provide a lot of online content on social media because that is where people are. That is where people are learning how we navigate the world, and we can educate better and better prepare ourselves for how to talk to grievers. That's what we're doing at Grieve Leave. We also will talk more about this. I'm sure we have a podcast now too, which is, as you know, that is a huge way of supporting people.
It absolutely is. And what the podcast has been also for me very therapeutic. It really has. And I love the fact, and I own the fact, that I'm not a clinician, I'm not a therapist, I'm not selling anything. I'm just here to truly support. That's what it is. And in supporting, I find myself supported as well. I love the fact that your meetings can be anywhere, in a bar, at a yoga class, anything like that. I just love that. And it really hit me when you talked about the group you went to in a church, because I was just doing some orientation and onboarding for a widows support group that I'm helping out by trying to help them give some substance to the local group in meetings and everything. And they talk specifically about they don't want you to meet in a meeting room at a church because they want to keep it in a very public place to make everyone and anyone comfortable about attending. So I applaud that a whole lot, actually.
Thank you.
As I also do your work about grief in the workplace and talking with employers, that is something that is sorely needed, that employees, they try so hard. I know I went back to work after my mom died, after the 3 days, and we've had the funeral and we've had the burial, and all the out-of-town family and guests have gone back to work and everything, and here I am back at work. Now, I happened to work in a nursing home, so they were pretty understanding and tolerant of what I needed and everything. But I have to say it was extremely difficult for me, and it was complicated by the fact that my mom had been a patient in that very nursing home and died in that very nursing home. It was months before I could go to that floor that she had been on. And they would call me and need something. And I'd say, could you please come down to my office? Because I just can't. And my employer was quite tolerant of that. But many are not. They don't understand that if they give just the tiniest little bit, they will have a loyal and dedicated employee for a long, long time.
Yeah. But they're so scared too, right? Like it's like we've been taught as a society that grief is a thing that we don't talk. It's not workplace appropriate. We could never mention it. They had their bereavement leave. That's their business. I don't want to bother them. I don't want to bring up something hard. Right. And then what you're speaking to, Kathy, is how it is actually like the opposite of what retains an employee. What makes them feel loved and cared for at your employer is someone who acknowledges them.
Absolutely.
You know?
And I tend to find that if someone has been through grief themselves, they certainly are going to be more understanding and more tolerant. But unfortunately, grief is one of those things that until or unless you do experience it yourself, it's really hard to understand.
You can't. Well, it's like we want to imagine that it will never happen to us.
Exactly.
Like it is so much safer to just shut out the idea of grief. And then when you're in the club, it's like, maybe this is going back to what we were saying earlier. Like there are beautiful things in grief. Obviously, you and I get to talk about them all day, you know, on our respective communities. But, you know, one is that grief is a great connector. You realize once you're in the club, how many other people are in the club. But it also does make you realize, like, makes you appreciate every day that you have. Like, I feel like I've become a much calmer, more present person since the deaths of both of my parents, that it's like, okay, I get the privilege of showing up to this world.
Right.
Let me take it easy, you know?
Yeah. And I was just speaking with actually another guest. I did a podcast right before this one. I recorded one. And he and I were talking a little bit about how grief is different for everyone. It's like fingerprints. You know, everybody's fingerprint is different. Snowflakes are different. And I myself have experienced 4 major losses in my life. And it puts me in several categories that I understand. Each of those deaths was different. I first lost my father, and he was not able to walk me down the aisle for my wedding because he was ill in the hospital with cancer. After that, I lost an infant child, less than 24 hours old, due to an infection that I acquired in the hospital. After that, I lost my mother, and then I lost my husband. And my husband, Tom, it's been 6.5 years now. And that was the glioblastoma. Tom was retired Army. He was a Vietnam veteran. His glio was said to have come from Agent Orange.
Interesting.
And fortunately, we were able to get the VA to believe that, which is not something they do willingly, such that, you know, I'm taken care of between the VA benefits and the medical insurance that I received because of Tom's service. I'm doing okay for old age, you know, much better than a lot of people are that have to exist solely on Social Security.
That's really tough.
It is.
I'm glad you have that support.
It is, you know, and that's one reason I can do the podcast like I do and not pick up any sponsors or ads or anything. It's just here for people who need it. And we talked about glioblastoma. I remember distinctly the surgeon coming in after they did a biopsy And he said, although we don't have the report back, he said, I can tell you, I believe this is the glioblastoma multiforme grade 4. And he said, and there's 3 things I can tell you about this glioblastoma. He said, it is the most aggressive type of cancer. Number 2 is it is different for every single person who has it. And number 3 is there's absolutely positively no cure. And 8 months later, almost to the day, my husband died. And it was tough. Yeah. Now, I find it interesting because I've always, and probably not always, but most of my life anyway, I've been really an independent woman. I was a single mom for years before I married Tom. He was, an additional marriage, I call it. I don't like to number him, but he was an additional marriage. And we both kept our independence, even though we had a persona as a couple. And it worked out well. He was my best friend that we did so much. And I found myself really, like you, not feeling supported at all, which for me was curious because, gosh, I'd lost my father, my mother, and a child. Why was this time so hard? But it was so hard because there was no support out there. There just wasn't. And at that time, there really weren't a lot of bereavement groups that I knew about. There was no one around that could give me the resources about where to go or anything. And that's what I wanted to change, just like you do with Grieve Leave.
I think that's wonderful. And you said that you lost him 6 years?
6.5 years ago. Yeah.
6.5. I'm so sorry for your loss. And 8 months is such a short period of time.
It is. And in that 8 months, my life changed 100%. I wound up giving up everything and everybody to take care of him because you know how it is. You need blood.
You have to be a caregiver. Yeah.
Today is chemo day and your emergency visits and everything like that.
Can I tell you something that this is like not even a dark humor moment. It was just like a duh moment with my late father. At some point before he died, maybe like 2019 or so. And I was just sitting with him chatting at the kitchen table. And I said something like, Dad, did you take any time off when Mom got sick? And he just I'm just imagining him eating oatmeal or something. And he just put his spoon down and looked at me and he was like, yeah, I took time off when your mom got sick. Like I took 6 months off.
Yeah.
He was like, how do you think it was laughable to him.
Yeah.
I'm a kid. I don't know.
Well, yeah.
I didn't know at the time. I didn't. But of course you can't keep living your life when your partner is dying.
Exactly. Yeah. No, you can't unless, no, you can't.
More family, right?
Like I was going to say, unless they're in a facility. But even when Tom was in
my nursing home,
he was in a veterans home, the equivalent of a nursing home for veterans.
Yeah.
And I was there every day.
Yeah.
So no, you can't.
It changes everything.
It literally changes everything. Now, however, are you finding that there is a trend where there are more podcasts, more books, more groups, more resources? Why do you think that happened?
Yeah. I have 2 thoughts. Number 1, yay. Right? Like
absolutely.
Actually, maybe I have like 3 thoughts here. 1 is yay. How great is that?
Yeah.
That we are finally acknowledging this deeply human thing that we have spent the past couple hundred years pretending like actually wasn't a part of the human experience, when actually like for all of human history, we've grieved out loud and it has been a part of our humanity. It's been a part of our community.
Right.
Over the past however many years, let's call it 10 years, but maybe even less, I think 2 big things have happened. 1, I think mainstream conversations around mental health are just happening more. And we particularly, I want to thank Gen Z for coming in hot and really being ready to talk about their mental health unapologetically. I think us millennials were at the tail end, we dipping our toes into, we walked so Gen Z could talk about mental health. And it is now just more socially accepted and talk about your mental health. And as you know, as well as I do, at the crux of so many feelings that we have, of so many challenges that we have in our lives, grief is often central. It is often a loss that triggers so many other feelings.
Right.
And so when we talk more about mental health, of course, conversations about grief are going to increase. I think the second big thing is not going to be a surprise to you that I'm going to say. It's the pandemic.
Absolutely.
I think that the pandemic created an environment for us that, yes, it just increased people's having to confront their grief in ways they didn't before, whether that was the pandemic just destroying everyone's sense of normalcy. We grieved a world that changed.
Absolutely.
Or it's losing people to COVID. But also I think the pandemic helped us connect with each other in new ways, particularly digitally.
Yeah.
And the amount of grief support, Instagram accounts, TikToks, podcasts that have grown in the past 4 years makes me so happy.
Oh, me too. Me too. Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
It's like people are hungry for these conversations.
Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right about COVID, because when businesses, for example, started switching to virtual meetings and everything like that, I think it made us really realize, well, gosh, if I can do this locally, I could do this with somebody on the other side of the world.
Totally. And it also is like, the thing about grief is you feel like you were the only person in the entire world in that moment who understands how you feel. Yep. The internet allows you to actually connect with other people who might not be local to you, Definitely. Right? Like me and Durham, North Carolina, not the biggest town in the world, though we are wonderful. We're a lovely mid-sized city, don't get me wrong, but we're not New York. I can't just go to like a bereavement group for people in their 30s.
Yeah.
That doesn't exist. It
Right.
didn't exist anyway. Right. And so starting online and connecting with people online is life-changing. And it can literally be a lifeline for people who are just like otherwise feeling like they're the only person in the entire universe who has ever felt that way. And then you see one person's TikTok and you're like, oh,
yep.
Oh, they get it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And with things like social media in general, you can find someone who is about at the same emotional level as you are with your grief.
Yeah.
If you are still in that angry stage, that's fine. If you're in the, new phrase being coined, that coping ugly stage.
Ooh, I haven't heard that yet. What is coping ugly?
I just read an article and it said coping ugly. And the article actually was about how younger generations are dealing with grief. And that's where this expression came from. And it could mean anything as menial as binge watching Grey's Anatomy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or sitting on your sofa with a quart of Ben and Jerry's ice cream. Yeah. The same clothes you've been wearing for 4 days.
Yes. Yeah.
That's coping ugly.
And got it.
It's certainly something that the baby boomers would never have thought of saying, because
normalizing it.
They wouldn't admit it.
Yeah.
We wouldn't admit it. And I love that things like that are coming out in the open. And there are also so many more modalities. But I have to ask you, here's my profound question.
Oh my God, I'm
of
so
the broadcast.
Excited.
Are you ready for this? Okay.
Let's go.
Do you feel that grief is a mental health disorder?
Oh my God, I could talk about this all day, Kathy.
Somehow I figured you could.
So here, I'm gonna answer your question by telling you why I've decided to go down the path that I have gone professionally.
Okay.
I come from a medical family. My dad was a physician. Like, I was taught growing up that, you get a problem, you treat that. You go see a specialist, you take meds, you heal, like you take your time and you get better. And again, as we talked about earlier, I seemed to be doing great. I worked through the loss of my mom and overcame that. Ostensibly, that's how it looked. And I feel like the older I've gotten and the more that I have experienced grief, the more I have been like, oh, wait a minute. I'm not sick. Grief is not a sickness. Grief is not a problem to be solved. Grief is normal and is a part of being human. It is a part of a life that is well lived. And sometimes we can get into a place in our grieving where we deserve clinical support. Sometimes we need that additional clinical support. Doesn't mean we are necessarily like disordered. It does not mean that we are ill, but it means that we deserve to feel better than we do every day. I love my therapist. Oh my God, she is the goddess and I am obsessed with her. But Kathy, I chose to not go back to school for social work. I chose to continue to build Grieve Leave with the background that I have in government and policy. And first, as an educator, I started my career in education. And that is the lens that I choose to bring to this work, because I actually do not believe that grief needs to be in the realm solely of therapists to support you through. And I think that is aligned to you and the work you're doing on this podcast, because you own that you're not a clinician. You talk about that and you're like, nope, I am normal. I am you. You are me. we're just like two chicks who are grieving and
Right.
understand that.
Right.
I think that is what will change the world.
Okay.
If grief is solely a disorder and a mental health issue, then it is in the hands of doctors and other clinicians and therapists, then like that ain't working. Yeah. We don't have enough practitioners who are trained and qualified, quote unquote, to support you in your grief. So like something's got to change.
Yeah.
We need to democratize grief support
Yes.
because it's not always clinical. So anyway, that's my long way of saying no.
I love it. I love everything you said about it. One thing in particular, and I don't, maybe you were aware that you used the word, but I love the fact that you said, if you deserve help.
Yeah.
I love that, as opposed to the if you need help. Because, oh man, that need thing. Did you ever have anybody tell you you need to get some help, child?
Oh my God.
Yeah.
No. But Kathy, but that was like a badge of honor to me.
Yeah.
I was the good kid. I was the kid that didn't need help.
Yeah.
And that is a messed up way to approach what we deserve.
Exactly.
We deserve to feel better.
Exactly.
We deserve to be the best version of ourselves as much as we can be.
Yeah.
It is not like you're not weak.
Right. And I honestly think one of the most therapeutic things we can do for ourselves, and I talk a lot about self-care, so this goes in the realm of self-care, is to find some different things, different modalities that you might try yourself. And that's one of the things that we like to do on the podcast, is bring in some different modalities here and there. I mean, we've talked about crystals. We've talked about hypnosis. We've talked about psychics. We've talked about some very obscure things like the energy alignment method, which is popular in the UK, and all of that. And many of them I have personally tried because I wanted to be able to know that if I'm going to allow this podcast to cover it, that it's nothing, I mean, it's something at least legitimate. Maybe it didn't help me, but maybe it'll help someone else. So, and I like to do the whole technique about give them enough to be curious about it. Give the listeners enough to think, maybe I want to check that out a little bit more. I don't want to tell them everything. For one thing, there's not enough time in my life. But the other thing is, it's just a little bit. Have you ever thought of doing this? And other times it'll just be, look, I interview a lot of authors on the podcast, and I love doing that as well. Or we'll talk about conferences, different things like that. I just try to offer those resources wherever they may be.
Which is so awesome. And I think like grievers want that. Like your listeners, our listeners right now listening to this podcast episode are probably thinking like, man, here are two women who have tried all kinds of things to support themselves in their grief. And it's like, I think also part of being a griever, particularly early in your grief, maybe you're still coping ugly, as you said. It's like, I didn't trust anyone else's opinions. I like had to learn.
Oh, absolutely.
You have to just like be in it and be in the coping ugly phase. It's not that there are linear stages of grief. There aren't, but it is that you need to experience for yourself.
Right.
However your grief is manifesting.
Right.
You work through it. And maybe something like, I'm not a crystal girly. I'm not, but I am a yoga girly. Yoga changed my life after my dad died. And that is probably the most like woo-woo spiritual that I get, really. Yeah. But it like that has been so integral for me and my own grieving. But I mean, your girl here, I also love some retail therapy, Kathy. I'm not going to lie to you.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That sometimes helps me feel a little better. Okay. Like whatever you need.
Yeah. The Amazon driver knows more about my life, I think, than I would like him to.
My shout out to Eddie from FedEx who knows me and will like ping me on my phone when I have a delivery.
Oh my goodness. I love that. I love that. Oh my gosh. This has been such great conversation, but sadly, the time is winding down. And this is the part in the podcast where I actually will turn the microphone over to you. For some guests, I'm a little anxious doing that. For you, not at all. I could leave me a microphone. I could listen to you all day. We could talk all day, I think.
I think
without a doubt. Yeah, heaven help the little cafe that ever gets the two of us in it at the same time, because they'll have to stay open. And anyway, I'm going to turn the microphone over to you so that you can address our listeners just by yourself without me leading you on with questions. And I do want to remind you, or tell you if you don't already know, that we have listeners at different times in over 103 countries around the world. So give them all a talk, and the floor is yours.
Yes, Kathy, first of all, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to connect with your wonderful community. And folks who are listening, the As I Live and Grieve podcast, clearly you are someone who wants real talk about grief. You probably also don't believe that grief is clinical. You probably also don't believe that you need to be cured. Like, you just are. Yeah. And if you are a friend of Kathy's, you're a friend of mine too. The Grieve Leave community is absolutely here for you as well. GrieveLeave.com is where you can find all of our online resources. We release a blog every weekend on Sundays. Follow us on TikTok, on Instagram, on Facebook. So that means whether you are in Australia or Jamaica or England or somewhere else, you can access our resources. But most of all, I want to tell you about the podcast that we just launched called Grief, where we interview all kinds of folks who are either in the grief space, so maybe they are authors, maybe they are physicians, maybe they are other kinds of mental health experts, maybe they are grievers who have experienced divorce, have experienced deaths of loved ones, cope in all different kinds of ways. You can hear their stories. And then if you are entertained by my grief buffet of a life and you enjoy laughing in a self-deprecating way about grief, also tune in, because I love to share stories about my own experience growing up with grief and what it means now to be a young adult, sort of young. I don't know, maybe I'm old now, but to navigate this terrain of what it's like to be a single woman in her 30s who is also grieving. Grieve Leave is here for you. Follow us. Yeah, Kathy, thank you. I can't thank you enough. This is such a joy talking to you.
Oh, it's definitely my pleasure. And, podcasts, episodes like this one that have been such great conversation always leave the door open for a revisit. So
I want to come to upstate New York. I got to get a Half Moon cookie. What else do I need to get from upstate New York?
White House.
I don't know what that is.
Wait, what's that? White hot dogs?
I don't know. Is that, I was going to say a garbage plate. I need a garbage plate.
Oh yeah, you need a garbage plate. Definitely need a garbage plate. Yeah. Things up here. In fact, there are stores now of just New York State products or Rochester products. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Oh, I love this.
Well, yes.
I have to tell you, I'll get emotional again. Like, I'm emotional all the time. It's fine. It's so funny that I heard your accent and it felt familiar to me, because that's how my dad talked. And maybe it didn't fully sink in for me. And I know that voice. I know that accent, and it reminds me of him and his whole side of the family. And I thank you for that connection to my family. And I just really appreciate that. It made my day.
Oh, well, I am so glad, in connection, what it's all about. We are now in each other's networks, and yes, I would be delighted to have you back again for another podcast. So thanks. We will have to approach that at the right time. Other than that, listeners, I just want to say thank you again for tuning in. And each time I do one of these episodes, I'm reminded by the fact that when I went to the conference last January, PodFest, and I was still trying to learn more about podcasting, and I was especially trying to learn about AI, artificial intelligence, which is probably a door best left closed as far as I'm concerned. But when I went to PodFest, someone said as I was leaving a presentation that the reason listeners tune into podcasts is not because of the guest that you have that week, but it's because of you, the host, and they have established a relationship with you. So to each and every one of my listeners out there, thank you for being my friend. Please take care of yourselves and tune in again as we all continue to live and grieve.
Thank you so much for listening with us today. Do you have a topic that you'd like us to cover, or do you have a question from one of our episodes? Please email us at info@asiliveandgrieve.com and let us know. We hope you will find a moment to leave a review, send an email, and share with others. Join us next time as we continue to live and grieve together.